Welcome to our closing plenary session. It's a panel on tariffs and the potential impact in international energy markets from NAFTA to Asia and the European Union. But first, I have a few housekeeping announcements for you. First of all, I am Norman Peterson from the Professional Education Council of the EBA. I'd like to remind you to fill out your registration forms. Those are incredibly valuable to the PEC, which is, that's kind of a fancy name for the program committee. Our primary function is to put on this program and then the annual meeting that comes up this coming May 6th and 7th here in the at the Renaissance in Washington, D.C. Second, I would like to urge you to consider signing up for the Professional Education Council, which is the program committee. I can tell you from several years of working on it, it's a lot of fun. You do get to, work with each other and work on putting together these programs, and it's very gratifying. So I urge you to go online, just go to the EBA website, and if you go to committees, you'll see as one of the committees, the PEC, Professional Education Council, and sign up for the PEC. And just one last thing, for the dinner tonight, the reception and dinner, because that is a CFEBA event, and it's a charity event, you will have to be reticketed and you'll have to go out past the registration desk and then come back in to register and to be admitted to this evening's event, because it is, as I said, a charitable event, and so there will be the additional fee. That, by the way, would be a really good time to fill out your evaluation forms and drop them off at the EBA registration desk. So with that, I'll turn you over to Alex Whittington, who will be your moderator and will introduce our panelists.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. We're here to talk about tariffs and the potential impact on international energy markets. Just as a way of a little bit of background, as we all know, we've seen the administration continue to look to tariffs as a tool of choice to achieve broader economic and trade policy goals, including notably and recently with respect to China. This is all happening as the administration also looks to negotiate and renegotiate a number of bilateral and multilateral trade agreements. So with the potential of future tariffs on China in the news, we have three experts here today to talk about various dimensions of that issue. We'll hear from each of them, then we'll have a bit of a discussion amongst the panel, and then open it up to questions and comments from all of you. Our first expert here, Kevin Book, is going to start us off. Kevin heads the research team at Clearview Energy Partners, an independent firm here in Washington that serves institutional investors and corporate strategists. In his analytical capacity, Kevin covers economic and policy trends in oil, natural gas, coal, and refined products. Kevin appears frequently in print and broadcast media in Washington and around the world, and he's going to talk a little bit about tariffs and the impact on markets. So I turn it over right now to Kevin.
Thanks. Okay. Thank you, Alex. I'm going to do some level setting just to put some numbers out there. I went to a school called the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, which by itself does not make one either a lawyer or a diplomat. I do not promise to practice law or to be diplomatic during the course of our discussion afterwards, and I look forward to it. The very first slide I have to give is to say, don't listen to me, don't trust anything I say, and please, God, don't make an investment based on what I'm about to tell you. The agenda, such as it is, I've given you more slides than I intend to go through, but the tariffs in question are a function of the Trade Expansion Act, Section 232, the tariff in 201, of the Trade Act of 74 and 301 under the USTR's authority. And I'll give you some numbers for those. But first, given that we have recently had the USMACA, it sort of rhymes with NAFTA, right? No, it doesn't. And if you look at the sort of the size of North American trade as a starting point, it's probably worth thinking about. Coal and related exports to Canada. What I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna read these so that I don't get them wrong. Please bear with me, but I'd like to be wrong for good reason rather than bad reason. Coal and related exports to Canada, 293 million in the trailing 12 months through August. Exports to Mexico, 362. You take North American trade, it's 13% of U.S. coal trade. So that sizes that. Crude oil imports both from Canada and Mexico, 51 billion. Coming in from Canada, 13. From Mexico, 42% of U.S. oil trade is North America. Refined products, 34% of trade. It's imports a little bit from Canada, billion. 25 billion to Mexico going out, much bigger number. LPG and related, 24% of total trade, again, North America. 2 billion coming in from Canada, 2 billion going out to Mexico. LNG, relatively small amount, 8 million going north to Canada, 800 million going south to Mexico. It's about 15% of U.S. LNG trade, the 12 months through August. Moving to, sorry, that was supposed to animate all at once. I realized I left you behind. Pipeline gas going south, 2 billion, coming south from Canada, 4 billion. Because pipelines do not cross oceans, that's 100% of total trade for pipeline gas. That one should have been easy. Electric power, about 2 billion coming south, 100% again. Pipeline and drilling steel, not an energy good, but very much a part of our discussion today. About 200 million coming south from Canada, about 800 million, 750, 800 million coming north from Mexico, about 27% of total. Ethanol, 44 million, relatively small amount from Canada coming south, 51 million going south to Mexico, but politically so big. And finally, all goods, just to keep a size, because this is the number that comes up a lot, 65 billion net imports from Canada, 127 billion net imports from Mexico. So when you look at the numbers writ large, energy is pretty small. That's sort of the bulk of that slide. Now, what if we had a midsummer energy trade war? What if it were to continue? I don't know if you can see all of the print, but this essentially shows you the outbound tariffs, steel tariffs, aluminum tariffs, and inbound retaliations since March. In size, in proportion, China has come back against energy goods in several different ways. One of the first retaliations was against ethanol in response to steel tariffs. Relatively small part of exports going to China, but a big market opportunity, essentially cut off. There were nuclear reactors and batteries inbound from China that we targeted under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 74 in July. But the big numbers that caught a lot of people's eyes were essentially all of the U.S. energy goods except for oil and liquefied natural gas that China put tariffs on, 25% tariffs on, with a few exceptions, but essentially across the board, Chapter 27 with a harmonized schedule. And that was in July in response to the 34 billion tranche of Section 301 tariffs. Again, we'll talk about the details later. And China left LNG out until they added it in retaliation to the 200 billion tranche that happened in September. Again, I suspect we'll go through the details. On steel, I want to make a couple very quick points. If you look at total steel imports from all countries in the world year to date through September, 2018 is down about 10% from 2017 through September. Difference from about 27 million tons to about 24. And for pipeline and drilling steel, the delta is about 7%, from about 3.9 million to 3.6 million tons. If you look at the countries where we have tariffs applied, total steel imports are down about 9% year to date, and you can see that they're below sort of the trend line. The dotted blue trend line is 17, the solid blue 18. But if you look at the quota countries, you can see that there was a deep dive, and the average actually year to date is about 11%. But for total steel, they're recently up. Where you really see some drama, if you can think of numbers and charts as dramatic, is in the tariff countries versus quota countries comparison for pipeline and drilling steel. Essentially, you have the tariff countries are up year to date about 8% relative to a year ago. That translates to operators buying more at a 25% surcharge. And the quota countries are down 30% year to date because that's what quantitative limits do. They cut you off. And so there are some summary slides in your deck. Basically, the goal of the Commerce Department for the steel tariff was to stop 13.3 million metric tons of imports. Some of that is going to be pipeline and drilling steel because by the nature of the growing oil and gas industry, pipeline and drilling steel has grown from about 12% of steel imports to about 15% of imports over the last 3 years. Moving ahead to just a couple other quick points. I mentioned the quantitative part versus the tariff part. I also would say that just if you want to look at a couple other energy goods, solar is caught up in tariff rate quotas under Section 201 of the Trade Act. Right now, you don't see a lot of numbers changing in recent import data from the U.S. International Trade Commission data set, but you do see a spike in imports of volumes right ahead of the onset of tariffs. One of the dynamics here, and it was a combination of a quota and a tariff in January that the president imposed, was a rush to stock up essentially before the tariffs set in, which has a market dynamic of its own. For ethanol, I mentioned that the market had recently been sort of shut off in China by a tariff. It had been shut off before by tariffs. China opened up its market and then closed it up again. For LNG, it is still too soon to see the numbers. The latest data set don't show significant reductions in the Chinese volumes, but I suspect we may see them. We're definitely expecting to see a dynamic in January if the 10% tariff rises to 25%, which it is currently on track to do under the president's policies. And refined products, things are pretty flat going to China lately, but remember, a lot of those refined products are now facing 25% import tariffs. Crude oil is still out of the picture for now, but that too could change in the next round of tariffs. So just a few pictures. I realize that may not have been the most engaging thing to run through numbers in rapid fire, but I thought it would be a good way to start the discussion so we could have some level setting and understand the size of what we're dealing with. And with that, I will turn it over to people who have much more interesting things to say.
Thank you very much for that very engaging discussion. Next, we want to welcome David Lang to speak to the challenging steel tariffs. David is a partner in Baker McKenzie's North America Banking, Finance, and Major Project practice and is the global head of LNG. His practice focuses on energy infrastructure development, acquisition, and disposition, with a particular focus on LNG. David also assists clients in upstream, midstream, renewable energy, and petrochemicals.
All right. Thank you for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm not sure that I can follow those numbers with anything as engaging as Kevin had, but I'm going to delve in a little bit into some specifics about the steel tariffs and the routes that parties are taking to try and challenge those. So briefly, what I'm going to walk through is first an introduction to Section 232, which you keep hearing about in relation to the steel tariffs, the presidential proclamation implementing initial tariffs, certain exclusions from those, legal challenges to the proclamation, and constitutional challenge to Section 232 itself. So Section 232 forms part of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, which was a key Kennedy administration legislative success. It granted the president great authority in negotiating trade policy and was predominantly intended to allow the president to cut tariffs. One carve-out within the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 is Section 232, which is titled Safeguarding National Security. Section 232 allows the president to implement certain tariffs in order to protect the national security. The process by which Section 232 tariffs are implemented is the Secretary of Commerce conducts an investigation either on his own at the request of certain key figures or at his own volition. And so he conducts an investigation and then presents a finding to the president. And that report was presented to the president, I guess was commenced in April of last year and presented to the president in January. The president has, I'll get to the proclamation, but the president then has the ability to implement any tariffs that are appropriate. The considerations that the Secretary and the President look at in conducting this investigation and determining whether to apply tariffs are these national security tests of whether the items being referenced, whether we have the ability to meet production requirements for national defense within the U.S., and whether there's the impact of foreign competition on economic welfare has a national security impact. And it's that second point really that is where the Secretary of Commerce and the President have rested their arguments in favor of these tariffs, that the economic welfare of the country is damaged by the import of steel, certain steel products. It's worth noting that this delegation of authority from Congress to the President does have one carve-out where either House of Congress can override a presidential determination, but it applies only to petroleum and petroleum products. It does not apply to steel. So I'll talk now about the presidential proclamation initially implementing the steel tariffs. As I noted, this references the January 2018 report from the Secretary of Commerce. And in that report, the Secretary of Commerce had actually recommended a global tariff of 24% on all steel articles. The President did not follow that recommendation and instead implemented a 25% tariff and exempted Canada and Mexico from that tariff. And then additionally included a provision that allows for companies to apply for exemptions. There have been several subsequent proclamations that have adjusted what these tariffs apply to, and this may not even be up to date now, but you can see that the President has exempted and then removed exemptions for various countries depending on what lever he's trying to pull for negotiating trade policy. So I mentioned that companies are able to apply for exclusions from the 25% tariff on steel, and the Secretary of Commerce is granted the authority to provide those exclusions. And essentially what they look at in determining those exclusions is whether the steel articles are not produced in the United States in sufficient quantity or quality, and if there are specific national security reasons to allow the importation. The request needs to be made directly by the affected party, and there are certain additional requirements that make it challenging to get these exclusions. I'm not sure what the latest number is, but the most recent number I saw was that there had been 37,000 applications for exclusions from the tariff. I think roughly 6,000 of those were rejected as having errors in their submission, and so can be refiled. But overall, several thousand, I think it's under 2,000, have been approved, and a smaller number have been denied. The general there is general concern that there's inconsistency in whether exclusions are allowed or not. Some exclusions that are asking for exclusions for the exact same product from a different company have been, in one case allowed and in one case denied. And largely the determination seems to be whether or not a U.S. steel producer files an objection to the request. So there have been some challenges to the presidential proclamation, and the most significant one has been brought by Severstal, which is a steel importer, ultimately owned by the Russians. This was filed in the U.S. Court of International Trade back in March, and suggested that the national security justifications for 9705 were pretextual, and that in fact this is trade policy that is being implemented by the executive and should have been implemented rather than by the executive by Congress. So they're claiming that the executive authority under the proclamation exceeded the delegation of authority that Congress provided in the 1962 Act. So the arguments are that there's clear misconstruction of the national defense requirements, and that the process is flawed with inadequate review of the economic welfare, and also noted that there has been a failure to follow the Commerce recommendations. I mentioned that Commerce recommended a 24% global tariff, and that's not what was implemented. So this case is pending. I think it faces a lot of challenge. The historically deference is given to the president in implementing these deferred or these delegated powers. So I think that's a challenging case, but it's at least one challenge to the proclamation. Kind of taking it to the next level is a suit that was filed by the American Institute for International Steel and its members Simtex and Kurt Orban Partners. And this challenges the very constitutionality of Section 232 itself. And the suggestion is that Section 232 is an unlawful delegation of congressional responsibility to the executive. This case also faces serious challenges, but the argument is that Section 232 lacks an intelligible principle required for congressional delegation of authority, and that's the standard that is set by the Supreme Court for delegation of legislative type authority from Congress to the executive. Unfortunately, this is asking for an upending of 60 years of congressional deference, and in fact, there is an on-point case directly addressing the constitutionality of Section 232, the Federal Energy Administration versus Algonquin, which would need to be overturned, or some way of distinguishing this case from that case would be required. So this, again, is another challenging route to overturning the tariffs. So just to close out, Section 232, steel tariffs are likely going to be difficult to avoid. The exclusions are challenging procedurally to get, and the Commerce Department is overwhelmed with the applications. The presidential authority is unlikely to be overruled by the trade court, and the constitutional challenge is unlikely to see progress. So I think if we want to see a change in policy that removes the steel tariffs, the two routes are congressional action to take back their authority over setting tariff policy, setting trade policy, or new policy from the executive.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Aaron Padilla. Aaron is the Senior Advisor for International Policy at the American Petroleum Institute. He leads API's work to determine and represent the oil and natural gas industry's public policy positions on key international issues, including cybersecurity, trade, and global economic policy, as well as sustainability.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to join my panelists and Alex here. I'll provide for you a bit more of a window into a company perspective and provide you some insight from the experience that we've had at API representing our member companies in the midst of the trade policies that you've had described to you just now. In case you're not familiar with API, we're the nation's largest trade association representing all segments of the oil and natural gas industry. So we have member companies that are involved in upstream exploration and production, midstream and transportation, downstream manufacturing and retail, and service and supply companies that provide services and supplies to those other companies that are involved as operators of infrastructure in the rest of those segments. And the other aspect of our membership that isn't always known to policymakers in Washington especially is that we're very international. So there are US headquartered and significant US operations represented in our member companies, but we have many of the world's largest natural gas and oil companies that are also API members that have headquarters outside the United States. So you may think of a Chevron and an ExxonMobil if you're thinking of integrated supermajors, and they're certainly two of our largest member companies. But we also have among our members Shell and BP and Total. And among service and supply companies, we certainly have Baker Hughes and Halliburton, but also Schlumberger, and many other examples of how our membership is both domestic and international in its orientation. And it's that perspective that informs our policy positions and the way that we have worked to try to influence a significant change that we've seen in trade policy from the Trump administration that is a departure from the Republican and Democrat centrist consensus on trade policy that we've seen fairly consistently across administrations dating all the way back to the beginning of NAFTA and 1994 and the Clinton administration. So there's a particular quote from a commentator that I think tells us a lot about where we've ended up here today and where we're going in the Trump administration's trade policies. So for the benefit of those of you who are a bit further from the screen, I'll just read it here. It says, "Is free trade really making global markets more efficient? Or is it simply strengthening our adversaries and creating a world where countries who abuse the system, such as China, are on the road to economic and military dominance? If Mr. Trump's potential campaign does nothing more than force a real debate on those questions, it will have done a service to both the Republican Party and the country." So the first interesting thing about this commentator's quote is that it dates to 2011. This was when now President Trump was first considering to run against President Obama in 2012. And then this commentator is now the lead trade negotiator for the United States. This is Bob Lighthizer in an op-ed that he wrote in 2011. And it, I think, increasingly reveals more and more about what is driving this administration's trade policy. I think first, in terms of substance, the point that Ambassador Lighthizer makes about China forming kind of the core of what his thinking has been for a while and what is now the core of the administration's thinking is that it's mostly about China. And we see even in the negotiations to update NAFTA that has resulted in the newly agreed USMCA and the tariffs that are imposed on steel on many more actors than just China, there really seems to be at the heart of all of that either a desire to establish a precedent that can be applied to China or to protect the United States' interests in a way that mirrors the way that the Chinese have made the system work best for them, or to address China's practices head on. And the second aspect of this, which is an obvious illustration of the administration's policy, is the fact that Bob Lighthizer is leading a lot of it. And I think that there are three features of where we are today that illustrate that or that are an indicator of that. First, Ambassador Lighthizer has survived. He's not just survived, he's thrived. He's really become increasingly influential in driving the administration's policy against others who have had policy views that are adversarial to where we are today. Secondly, he's been successful. The NAFTA has been renegotiated and we have a finalized agreement now, the USMCA, and there are other examples where his influence on policymaking has resulted in actual policies that are being implemented and have been successful culminations of campaign promises that President Trump made. And then finally, he's becoming singularly influential within the administration. Trade policy in the administration from day one has been driven by a very small number of individuals. And I think I would argue that it's being driven increasingly and singularly by Ambassador Lighthizer himself. This is a product of our member company's experience of interacting with the administration, a meeting that I was able to participate in just yesterday with the ambassador himself, and other ways in which I think we can read his influence into the direction that the administration has gone. So when we began to engage with the administration on this change in trade policy, a task for us was to take stock of things like what does the North American energy market look like? What is at stake in the renegotiation of NAFTA? We had to reacquaint ourselves with a reality that had unfolded over the life of a trade agreement like NAFTA. The illustration here in this map that I'll point out are a couple of features. One is all of those yellow dots are 80-some refineries in the United States that receive imported crude oil from either Canada or Mexico. And a good number of those refineries on the Gulf Coast in the United States receive crude from Mexico, manufacture that crude into refined products, and export a good amount of what they produce right back into the Mexican market. So there's an incredible interdependence and interlinkage of energy markets in North America that we see at play today that was at stake in the NAFTA negotiations. And to our members' view and to our industry perspective, it's an illustration of the benefits of free trade and a classic illustration of comparative advantage and efficiencies that you get in the trade of products across markets than if you were to only contain those products and maintain an economy that was closed to trade. And then you see that the flows go in multiple directions. It's not that there's any one particular flow that's greater than another. Across product categories that might be true, but generally you see trade in hydrocarbons going back and forth across US, Canada, and Mexico. Again, just another illustration of the fact that we have an incredibly interdependent market that was at stake with the renegotiation of NAFTA. And then this depiction here illustrates a key argument that we have made to the administration to try to help them to take stock of what's at stake and what's potentially needed to be traded off as they pursue a generally more protectionist set of trade policies. So the blue is oil and natural gas production in the United States, which we are all aware has been surging. And the red is our net petroleum imports. So from a pure energy security perspective, this is a good story for the United States and something that we've argued to the administration and that we argue to Republicans and Democrats alike is good for the country and is worth preserving and worth having trade policies that generally promote an extension of this picture that we see over recent years rather than something that would undermine it. And then we also see right at the tail end of that red line that shows net petroleum imports an uptick, which means that the generally downward trend of importing less than we export has changed slightly in the last few months. And that's due to probably one thing, and that's the decision that the Chinese government has made to not buy any more crude from the United States in the last couple of months. They haven't done this by sending a market signal of issuing a retaliatory tariff. They've simply directed their buyers in their market not to buy any more US crude. So we already see a direct illustration of how the Section 301 tariffs that Kevin first mentioned are resulting in some negatives for the energy industry. And that's the main thing I think that illustrates energy in the midst of all of this. We were never a core part of the problem that the administration identified that needed to be addressed, but we've been caught in the crosshairs of protectionist trade policies. And we're collateral damage as the trade dispute continues to escalate and remains unresolved with the Chinese on Section 301 and the 232 tariffs, which I'll get to. So there was also a lot at stake for our member companies and for the US in the NAFTA renegotiations because the Mexican hydrocarbon market has just recently reopened to foreign investors. There have been a series of bid rounds since 2015 in which many of our member companies have participated, and this pie chart breaks down who's won those upstream bid rounds. So here you see that we've broken it down by API member companies and non-API member companies, and then we've carved out those non-API member companies that are either Russian or Chinese. And so you see that 44% of the upstream bid rounds have been won by API members, 45% have been won by non-Russian and non-Chinese, non-API members, and then 11% have been won by state-owned companies from Russia and China. And this plays into another argument that we've articulated with the administration, is that you want to do everything that you can to promote US investment in the Mexican market that's just opened to our border, rather than ceding that to a competitive landscape that includes some of our adversaries. So this is a suite of arguments that we've made to try and make the case for the policy provisions that were priorities for our members in the NAFTA renegotiations. And here's where we've ended up. Overall, API members support the new USMCA. Well, as you can see from the color coding here, it's not necessarily because across the board it's better than the old NAFTA. In some cases, even for key provisions for our member companies, it's not as ideal as we would have liked. It's not as good as the current NAFTA. In other cases, it is modernized and it is better. But our calculus, our members' calculus, is not just based on a comparison with the current NAFTA. It's based on a comparison with no NAFTA. And I think the president has very clearly articulated consistently that he's willing to withdraw the United States from NAFTA. So we're weighing our support of the new USMCA against that as a probability as well. Let me speak to the investment protections and investor state dispute settlement part of this. This is a provision that kind of ended up as a yellow in our stoplight color coding here. But as late as August, as the negotiations were culminating with Mexico, it was a potential red. Ambassador Lighthizer and the administration wanted to essentially eliminate ISDS with regards to U.S. investors in Mexico and Canada. And where we've ended up is that there is still ISDS eligibility for U.S. investors in Mexico, especially so for those who come from 5 particular sectors. Oil and natural gas is one of those particular sectors. And there's other complications and complexities to this, but generally it's much better than the direction that we were going. And the preservation of the core aspects of investor state dispute settlement work well enough for our member companies to have got to a position of support for the new USMCA. And then the other particularly important part of this is the very last row, which is that just having a successor to NAFTA, the presence and the possibility that a new USMCA will come into force, means that per the U.S. Natural Gas Act, by virtue of just having a free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico, those increasing natural gas exports that Kevin spoke to, that we have, natural gas going from the U.S. to Mexico, are essentially automatically liberalized. If you don't have a free trade agreement with another country, then you're subject to the permitting process through the Department of Energy, where the DOE has to determine that for each and every company in each and every case, it's in the national interest for the U.S. to export to that other market. And so our members' preference was to have a free trade agreement in place where those exports are essentially automatically liberalized. So just the mere presence of and the probability that we're going to have a successor to NAFTA is important with regards to liberalized hydrocarbon trade. So then coming to Section 232 and the steel tariffs, let me provide an API member company perspective to the point that David made about how the product exclusion process has been a mixed bag for petitioners. So of those 37,000+ petitions that are in the docket, about 600 or so are from API member companies. Those companies that are represented among ours that are in the docket are steel consumers, the Shells, the Hesses, the BPs. It's also represented, though, by service and supply companies that import steel and make other manufactured products that are then installed in U.S. energy infrastructure. And then we also have steel member companies among our membership that are integrated either in their value chains or in their supply chains across borders, not all inside the United States. And so they're negatively impacted by the tariffs because some of the steel that they need to make their final steel products comes from origins outside the United States. These numbers illustrate that for our members, it's been a mixed bag. There have been 90-some rulings so far, and it's about 50-50 split in terms of petitions being granted versus petitions being denied. In our member company's case, it's exactly as David described. Whenever there's an objection from a U.S. steel manufacturer, their petition is denied. Whenever there's not, their petition is granted. And we have 4 petitions from our member companies in the docket that, from our observation, look identical to each other. There are 4 that have been denied on the basis of being deemed incomplete as a submission that look identical to other petitions that were granted. So we see some indications here that there's some subjectivity, there's some inconsistency in the way that the product exclusion process is working out for companies that are seeking to be excluded from the tariffs on the basis that the process has allowed for them to argue. And then for the Section 301 tariffs, Kevin described this well. We're affected, our industry, by the incoming tariffs on the U.S. side that the U.S. is implementing, the outgoing side in terms of the retaliatory tariffs that the Chinese have put into place, and other non-tariff retaliatory measures like a decision not to purchase any U.S. crude. And we've only had one success here in arguing to the administration that a product should be excluded from the list of those that we're applying tariffs to. And that's only a product called barite that's used in drilling muds, among the many dozens that we've made a case for that we also have said are essential for our member companies' supply chains, in terms of our demand coming from China and needing to be satisfied only by Chinese origin products. So it's been a mixed bag for us on the 301 front as well. And what we've said to the administration that's illustrated by this last slide is that what's at stake is the prospects of companies like Alex's. Their ability to tie up long-term contracts from buyers globally in order to promote the surging natural gas production that we have here at home that's ripe to be exported into global LNG markets. Increasingly, the viability of the projects that are depicted here in this table in North America is tied to those long-term buyers in Asia, and primarily long-term buyers in China if we're looking at one country vis-a-vis others. And when you have a retaliatory tariff in place of 10% to go up to 25% in January, then that makes it more difficult for US LNG projects to compete globally with others. And you'll see that there's actually one aspect of this slide that's just outdated now too, and that's the very top row. And that's LNG Canada, which appears in this slide as part of that bucket of projects that Bloomberg New Energy Finance deemed to be less likely to reach commerciality, which now has reached a final investment decision. But it's not in the United States, it's in Canada. I can't say that the fact that the US is engaged in a trade dispute with China has impacted the decision-making significantly that Shell and its partners have reached in that project, but at least illustrates that we are potentially engaged in a trade dispute with the Chinese that disadvantages the potential commerciality of LNG export projects in the United States vis-a-vis their global competitors. And this is, again, what we keep saying to the administration. You have, on the one hand, an objective of energy dominance to maximize U.S. energy production and maximize U.S. energy exports. And on the other hand, a set of trade policies that make steel more expensive, that make it more difficult to tie up long-term contracts with Chinese buyers. You can't have them both at the exact same time. You have to understand what the trade-offs are and bear in mind the energy aspects of your agenda that you carve away as you pursue a trade agenda that catches energy in the crosshairs and makes it more difficult to realize the energy objectives that you want to have simultaneously as you promulgate the suite of policies across your administration. So I hope that gives you a bit of a window into an API member company perspective, and we really look forward to further interaction with you as you have questions and as we kind of react to each other here on the panel. Thanks.
Thanks, Aaron. Just wanted to pose one question to the panel based on your presentation and give you all a chance to discuss what you think the broader impact of the tariffs are on U.S. energy projects and on companies, and how can companies adapt to what seems to be an ever-shifting landscape in terms of tariff and trade policy. You want to start us off, Kevin,
sure.
down there? We can move.
I think this is on. Yeah, so to some degree, the dominance agenda is, what you call it that. You can call it just the export agenda if you like. It's a reality for all the producers in this country. The demand is pretty flat, and the markets overseas are opportunities. And uncertainty stalls investment. So the degree to which there isn't an obvious trajectory, things like a tariff that could go from 10% to 25%, or new tariffs that can sweep in, have a tendency to stall investment. And even as you talk about trade globally, in $88, $90 trillion global economy, what's, a couple $100 billion of top-line tariffs on each side, it's just, it's basis points of basis points, who cares? Well, it matters when you have the investment stalled. On a project cost basis, steel sometimes is a big factor, sometimes it's a small factor, but there's some companies that are not in a good position competitively to complain for a variety of reasons, partly that they're competing with each other. And so they're at a natural disadvantage if you're, for example, trying to fill a pipeline open season. Saying that you're right on the edge of maybe not actually going through with it because of steel costs is not a good way to get people to sign up. So there are definitely some clear challenges when it comes to also addressing ways in which to combat these uncertainty-related investment risks. I'll stop there and maybe hand it off to you guys.
Yeah, I think there was a recent announcement that directly tied a delay in a project to the tariffs, and that was Magnolia LNG's delay of an FID until hopefully early next year. Now, of course, there are a number of factors that weigh into their timing of taking FID, but certainly that is a project that was counting on offtake from China as support for the project, and so the tariffs on LNG that project was to produce, as well as the tariffs on steel that are going to impact the cost of that project, have caused them to delay the FID. So it has real effects.
One other aspect I would highlight is the Chinese market itself. The Chinese market is an important one for U.S. energy companies. And so far, the retaliation and the escalation of the dispute between the US and China hasn't compromised the presence that US and US allied natural gas and oil companies have in an increasingly significant market in China. But it could. And that's what our members are worried about, that it will continue for a long time, and that the Chinese will feel compelled to begin to punish US investors and US companies that are trading into the Chinese market much more so than they are now. There's still a lot of room for China to act. And so that's another area where an escalating or a continuing dispute could harm US energy interests and US allied energy interests.
So building on that point, I wanted to get everyone's thoughts on next steps. What should we be paying attention to between now and, let's say, January 1 when tariffs jump? What should we be looking out for? What do we think the administration is thinking about doing? Opine away on the future of tariffs.
Well, if I could amplify something that both of my fellow panelists pointed out, particularly David's comments regarding Robert Lighthizer. If you go back to June 2016, when President Trump was still campaigning, he was at an aluminum recycler in Pennsylvania when he gave a thrilling speech about China, the enemy, and then went into chapter and verse of trade law and enumerated the exact three provisions that we talked about thus far, 232, 201, and 301. Now, I don't know a lot about the president's part, what he reads on his bedside table, but I'm guessing chapter and verse of trade law is not typical in a real estate developer from New York. So that seems a little foreordained. If there's something that you could say was something of a lock, looking backwards helps us look forward. Looking forward, we know that there's an election coming up in 2020. And two issues that have come up from the president on energy peripherally, steel and all that comes with it, and directly coal, speak to the swing state of Pennsylvania, a place where the president won by 42,000 votes. There's 5,500 coal jobs in Pennsylvania and maybe 12,000, 11,500 steel jobs, but there's a lot more Pennsylvania voters who know what coal and steel jobs were like, and it resonates with them. So politically, to the extent that there is a domestic political challenge, the near-term resolution is probably not going away because this is a popular way to appeal to some of those voters. In terms of the nature of the Section 301 challenge specifically, the problems the president and Ambassador Lighthizer are targeting are not problems that resolve themselves in weeks or months. This is China climbing the ladder to WTO accession and global economic growth and not following the rules in a way that the US could abide. This is a showdown that would not soon be resolved. So I think it is reasonable to expect that the tariff regime in both fronts is likely to continue for some time.
Yeah, I guess I would advance to the election that is right in front of us as something to watch, because if there is a swing in Congress, much of this trade law could change. I don't think that's the top priority of Democrats if they retake the House, but it could be on the list, and kind of Congress reasserting authority over trade policy might well be something that could be a victory for Democrats, because they could probably get Republicans in Congress on some Republicans in Congress on board. So I would keep an eye on that if you're looking for stability in trade policy. It could come by way of congressional action.
I would look for two indicators as an indication of how long tariffs and import restrictions, quotas, and the like may be in place. The first is farmers. For now, they're patient, but they're feeling the significance of closed soybean export markets and other ways in which the Section 301 dispute and the retaliation to the Section 232 steel tariffs have taken away crucial export markets for them. I think that their patience extends well beyond these midterm elections, but does not extend beyond the 2020 elections. So I think that's a key indicator. And the second is whether we see any narrowing of objectives that the US wants in negotiations with China. Right now, it's a categorical list that I think is the official one, which is stop doing everything that you're doing that's distorting markets and violating the ways in which the US engages in global trade. That's just not going to change. And I think you do have individuals in the administration who are also urging a narrowing of objectives and goals for the negotiation that will unfold with the Chinese. And if we see indications of that, then I think that leads to a greater rather than a lesser likelihood that the standoff or the escalation will reverse. But we could also be in for a very long-term economic Cold War with China that this is just the beginning of. So I think that's another possibility that we could see go well beyond 2020.
Thank you. So not a lot of great news right on that front. But so the question is, are U.S. energy projects at a comparative disadvantage, or are there any silver linings here that companies can look to take advantage of? In a world of bad news, is there anything positive that you can point to?
There's an extraordinarily good piece of news, which is that we have an enormous resource available at relatively low crude oil break-even prices, and it doesn't seem to be a problem except for getting enough takeaway capacity out of the Permian right now for both oil and gas. Our challenge is a different challenge. We have the challenges of adequacy and abundance, for which we are ill-prepared as a country after 4 decades of scarcity. But competitively, there are issues. Part of it concerns the nature of long-term contracting. 70% of the LNG market is still contract-based and not spot. Though the tenor of those contracts has shortened considerably, they still matter. And being able to lock in contracts and not have tariffs in the way is still a useful way to compete. To the extent that pricing, particularly to the extent that LNG has been the emblem of the administration's energy dominance strategy. And it was in Dominance Day on June 29th of 2017 at the Department of Energy that the president not only clarified what he meant by the policy, but also enumerated LNG project developments as examples of what it looked like. And so to the extent that global prices and advantages that adhere to having a Henry Hub-linked price could be weakened by the presence of tariffs, that's not particularly good news.
I guess one area of optimism is with Mexico, and there's a lot of development of gas pipeline projects into Mexico and power projects on the back of those. I think there's great opportunity in the sector there, and assuming USMCA is signed later this year, I think that should continue. I guess the other thought on crude oil is to differentiate it from LNG. Crude oil is liquid enough that I'll be interested to see how that uptick in net imports adjusts, whether if over time, the markets can be realigned so that we're still exporting, there's still other markets that aren't imposing tariffs on or bans on import of crude oil from the United States. So I think that crude oil development is still, getting that takeaway capacity out of the Permian and Eagle Ford. I think there's still opportunity there.
Please.
I think one part of an answer I would give to your question is that trade policy, whether completely free and aligned with the interests of the United States energy advantages or not, is only a relatively small part of the story of U.S. energy competitiveness. So we have some pretty significant trade policies that go against energy, as we've all described, but it still hasn't come even close to overwhelming the overall advantages that the relative abundance of energy production in the United States conveys for us as advantages, competitively, economically, and in many other ways. I think that will continue to be the case unless we see a dramatic escalation or an extremely long duration of just the sorts of policies that we were describing that run counter to our energy interests. But otherwise, I think the competitiveness of the U.S. with regards to energy is significant, and it's significant to even continue to generally be able to power us in the direction that we've been going in terms of production and competitiveness globally, in spite of the trade policies that we've seen from the administration, which provide some headwinds.
Thank you very much.
Can I just add
Please.
one thing? So I think part of what Aaron's getting to is the good news is still good news as long as the world is still in a good place. And we're still, the trade war is heating up, but it's not a hot war yet. Right? We haven't really gotten to the sort of exclusions and barriers to trade that predate GATT and predate the formation of the WTO. This is still a pretty good place. But economic growth drives energy demand. So let's not kid ourselves here. And you can find a lot of different ways to chart the impact. There's GDP-linked oil demand growth models. Or you can just say, what about trade in general? About 3.5 to 4 million barrels per day of the 100 million barrels per day consumed in the world are bunker fuels for ships. So if trade itself, not in energy, but trade, starts to slow down in some really catastrophic future environment, then yes, that would impact demand in a material way. It's the economic well-being of the world that sets the stage for the opportunity for the U.S. to compete and win in the world with our energy resources. And so we still need demand out there. And that I think is both the good news today, but also the caution for tomorrow.
Thank you. And on that note, I'd like to open it up to the room for comments, questions to any and all of our panelists. I think right in front, sir.
I must have a misconception about something. I've heard terms of the trade war heating up and the Cold War and trade. I thought we've had one for years. My understanding, and must be mistaken, is that we have an unsustainable trade deficit overall. And that whether the administration is going to Whether the administration is going about it correctly or incorrectly, I have no idea. But is that not the case? Do we have an unsustainable trade deficit? Have we had it before the president began implementing these tariff restrictions? Or is that not the case?
I think there are competing views, but the general economic perception is that your savings and your economic growth are the reasons why you end up with goods trade deficits in a lot of cases. And in some cases, one could even point to that not as unsustainable, but as a sign of the economic well-being and expansion of the U.S. economy. By the same token, it is a metric that the president has used, and he is the one setting the policy. Services trade offsets some of the goods trade deficit. Services trade is meaningful, but that's a big number, and it means something to the people who worked in those manufacturing jobs. So when you ask whether or not it's sustainable, it is clear that is the decision of the White House is to try to narrow that goods trade deficit.
Anyone else? No. Any further comments on that question? Okay, maybe a hand back there, please.
I had two questions related to judicial review. So the first one, one of the panelists spoke about the constitutional challenges to Section 232 and the dismal prospects for relief there. Is the reason that the challenges are constitutional rather than challenge to the president's action as arbitrary, that review under, say, the APA isn't available when you're talking about an executive action as opposed to an agency action? My second one's related, dealing with the exclusions that have been denied by the Secretary of Commerce. If someone believes that those exclusions have been handed out arbitrarily, is there a course of judicial review to seek recourse for that?
Thank you.
Yeah, let me answer the second one first. I think, yes, there is a course of review for arbitrary administrative action. On the first question, Section 232 and actions under Section 232 are being challenged legally from both angles. There is a challenge that the proclamation implementing the steel tariffs didn't adequately comply with Section 232. And then there is a challenge to Section 232 itself that suggests that it is an unconstitutional delegation of congressional authority over trade policy.
I mean, there's a broader international discussion going on as well as to whether or not, before the WTO, whether or not the use of Section 232 was proper, whether these were legal safeguards, and to what extent Section 232 properly implements Article 21 of GATT, which is the national security exception. Things go slowly at the WTO. So if you're waiting for the cavalry to ride in, it's on turtles. But it's riding.
Yeah, just on that, I think the WTO has not in the past found national security exclusions to be in violation of WTO policy. So I wouldn't look at that as any of these three routes as optimistic routes for challenging the tariffs.
Great, thank you. Additional comments, questions? Anyone else?
I actually
Right
have
there.
one. It's a follow-up to Harvey Ryder's question about arbitrary and capricious. Everybody in this room has a lot of experience with that sort of thing, as well as substantial evidence. And man, as soon as you were talking about, exactly the same applications, one being granted, one being denied, why aren't we seeing any court action here?
I think one reason is that it's still early. I think that there's so many petitions still in the docket. There's still an opportunity to resubmit a petition that was deemed incomplete if that was the basis on which one petitioner's case was denied. So I think that companies are still giving it a go. And there's a lot of other ramifications to challenging things legally that individual companies are taking into account, and so it's sort of a high bar at this early stage for any individual company, I think, to decide they're going to try and jump over.
No, I certainly agree with that. I think taking legal action is challenging to do at this early stage. The Severstall case is kind of one of the few that has challenged the application of Proclamation 9705, and that's the case that the Russian steel company has suggested that this isn't actually a national security issue at all. That's a pretext for resolving the deficits the trade deficits.
Just, to add to that, the exclusion process when it was announced in March might have been a little eyebrow raising for folks who think about how things used to work. Does everyone remember the crude oil export thing? Everyone, it was just a few years ago, you might have forgotten, right? So back then, the Bureau of Industry and Security at the Department of Commerce had this condensate processing thing that was going on. Essentially, if you ran condensate through the right kind of condensate processing unit with the right number of trays, it didn't matter if you had applied for the exception yourself. It didn't apply just to the person who asked for it. It applied to anyone who had the right kit. So there was a very expansive interpretation of these private rulings that BIS was doing that, yeah, you're good to go, you can ship it out. Well, the architecture of these steel exclusions could not be more different. It's very narrow. So I don't want to get wonky, but if you look at harmonized tariff schedule numbers, they're two-digit chapter numbers that expand out. So all of the hydrocarbons are in chapter 27, 2709 is crude, and then you go digit by digit out to 10 or 12 digits. They're at a 10-digit level of specificity. That is a very narrow application. We're talking about like crude with freckles, crude with red hair. Those are different products, okay? So, and in addition, it's limited to the applicant only, which means that if David applies for and gets an exception, I still have to apply for my own. And it's contestable very broadly. Only if you are an importer can you apply for the exception, but anyone can contest. Those terms are not exactly great terms, but if you remember what they set out to do, the Commerce Department's goal in this was for the good of national security to block 13.3 million metric tons of steel imports so that domestic production capacity utilization for steel would rise from 72%, which is where it was in 2017 or so, to 80%, which they deemed sufficient to protect us security-wise. So that means you can't say yes too many times. Right? You can't give too many exemptions. Australia got one completely without quotas at all. It depends on whether you read the Bob Woodward version, which was that there was a handshake and that's all, or whether it was that Australia attested successfully that there was no transshipment of Chinese steel through their country. But there's three countries, Korea, Argentina, and Brazil, that are subject to quantitative limits, that there was no exception process until recently. The process for getting an exception was, well, it's the art of the deal with it, right?
And the administration has continued to signal that they're committed to this as a program to achieve just the objective that Kevin re-articulated for them, which is to raise U.S. steel production utilization in the United States to 80%. And they're committed to not compromising the integrity of that as a policy objective by poking too many holes in it through granting product exclusions or exemptions to the quota or exempting countries wholly. And so, and that's applied equally across all tariffs and conversations we've had with the administration. It doesn't matter that you differentiate one particular one of these 10-digit products, HTS code products. That 80% utilization capacity that they're seeking to achieve for steel manufacturing in the United States applies equally and to all of the steel products that you can go down to that level of detail to discuss. So they're very committed to this as a policy, and you have to make a very carefully articulated case if you want for them to consider any special treatment, even if it does correspond, as it does in our case, to energy and to other objectives that are compromised by maintaining the integrity of a program to increase domestic steel manufacturing utilization.
Thank you very much. Any additional questions from the audience? Right, far back corner.
No, wait for the microphone. This is being recorded and they won't catch you unless you wait for the microphone.
So I'm paralyzed by the complexity of the question I'm going to ask you, because I'm trying to make it really simple, and I'm a utility lawyer, and I can't make anything really simple, but I can ask a question. So, yeah, I remember the 80s. I practiced in Michigan. We had automobile companies who bought domestic steel, and I can't remember if we were concerned about we weren't producing enough of your hydrocarbons at the time. Do you see this sort of policy, your meeting yesterday, do you see these folks as trying to take us back to a time where we made our machine tools, we made all of our own automobiles, we had enough of this stuff to stick in the tanks? Is that what's going on? And is it going to succeed?
Right.
That one's on you.
Okay. So I see the ideology or the paradigm that's informing the administration's policymaking as some combination of either a 1980s kind of U.S.-Japan kind of auto trade war lens applied to today, and or in that vein, maybe an extrapolation of what has happened to the U.S. steel sector to the whole of the U.S. economy, and a promulgation of policies that affect the whole of the U.S. economy that are defined by an understanding of what has happened only to steel. So that's half of the equation, I think. And so part of that strand of thinking, or part of that paradigm, is to get the United States back to something more of a self-sufficiency, and not really with regards to national security as we understand it in terms of steel that goes into making Bradley vehicles or tanks, but national security in terms of what many in the administration have said is just a straight equation to economics and to economic security. So that's one half. The other half, I think, of the paradigm is all about China, and it's all about changing market distorting practices and WTO exploiting practices that the Chinese have engaged in that have worked to their advantage. That half of the equation and that half of the paradigm has much more of a consensus. I think it's much more grounded in a mutual understanding among any collection of actors or stakeholders that you could think of, in terms of an agreement that it's a problem and an agreement that we as a country should try to address it and try to correct it. The president himself is more of a vessel for all of this, I think, rather than being the one who's driving the policy making. And sometimes it swings more in one direction or the other, or sometimes the president himself expands the scope of the policy making beyond what those who are driving the policy think was necessary to try to achieve the policy objectives, whether they be that sort of 1980s era kind of view of the world, or whether it be a we need to address China before it's too late view of the world, or some combination of the two. But that's what I see as kind of the driving strands of the paradigm that sit behind the policy making.
Any other comments on that question, gentlemen?
I have two questions. One, in the exclusion process, when steel manufacturers do oppose an application, do they have to try to demonstrate that whatever's at issue is available in the United States, or do they just say, I don't like it? That's number one. And number two is, are you seeing any attempt in international sales and purchase agreements involving LNG and tying things down, any attempt by sellers to sort of cover themselves with provisions that deal with uncertainties around what the tariffs might be and see if they can get away with that?
I think your second question is for Alex.
Right. I can't really speak to that, but I will say that from a company-to-company level, private sector level, in discussions with Chinese partners and counterparts, there's real understanding that the U.S.-China energy relationship really can be and should be a win-win relationship that's productive to both sides. So I think at the company level, at the working level, there really is kind of a goal to move beyond current tensions to get to a place where we can both benefit from what's become a very symbiotic relationship between our two energy industries. And the hope that eventually we can get beyond the tensions and move into a new and brighter phase, really.
Well, you won't answer it. I haven't seen your sales agreement with the Chinese buyer, but I have seen most of the other ones that are public record. And like most LNG sales agreements, they pass the risk of an import tariff onto the buyer. And so, and your executive team has publicly stated that the tariffs are not negatively impacting your existing agreements. So the impact is on subsequent. And now, now that there is in fact, this obvious tariff regime in place, I think that buyers will seek to shift some of that risk to sellers. But I think for the most part, existing sales agreements have that as a buyer risk.
And just to add on that, really see the broader U.S.-China LNG relationship is very long-term, and really hoping that the tariff issue that we're dealing with is more short-term. A lot of the LNG long-term arrangements that are in place will be in place really don't start for a number of years. So there's a hope there that over the long term, this issue will be resolved in some way.
And something I'd like to clarify is when Kevin Book refers to Alex Whittington's company, Alex Whittington is from Cheniere Energy, which is one of the premier LNG developers in the United States.
Thank you for clarifying that. Absolutely.
I could take a crack at your first question about the product exclusion process and the objections. We weighed in on the interim final rule that defined the whole process and stated what petitioners needed to be able to demonstrate and set up the way in which that would be adjudicated and allow for objections to be filed as well. And to summarize many detailed comments that we made, the gist of most of them was that we wanted, API member companies wanted for the process to be more tightly defined, to make it such that petitioners and objectors alike would be required to demonstrate the veracity along specified parameters of the claims that they would make. Either a claim that they could only get the steel from overseas, or the claim that they could produce it here domestically. Instead, to generally summarize the way that the process has been defined, and even as it has been recently updated, it provides a lot of latitude to decision makers at the Department of Commerce to interpret the petitions and the objections that they receive. And it doesn't require the petitioners and the objectioners to be precise along predefined criteria as to what might make their claims more verifiable. We had argued that, for example, if a domestic steel manufacturer wanted to object to a petition from an API member or anyone else for that matter, that they couldn't just make a vague claim that we can or we will be able to produce that product. We wanted for them to be able to demonstrate that they have a plan for allocating capital to increase capacity, that they would have an ability to get permits and to be able to produce additional capacity if they didn't have it online today by a certain period of time in the future. These sorts of things that would give someone at the Department of Commerce some sense of whether an objection was really one to take seriously or not. Instead, it gives a lot of latitude to those who are in the docket and to those who are adjudicating in the docket to make sense of what they're hearing. And generally, what we've seen from objections to our member companies' petitions is some very general claims that U.S. domestic manufacturers have made of, we can do that, or we will be able to do that. What we've tried to also make clear is that a procurement decision is made on the basis of many different things. Cost, clearly, but not just cost. And many of the specifications that our members have needed in the steel products that they have are ones that can often only be met by specialty manufacturers overseas who have capabilities that domestic manufacturers don't have. And that schedule is, as all of us understand, incredibly important in our industry. And once you decide to reach FID on a multi-billion-dollar or multi-hundreds of millions of dollar project, cost is key, but so is schedule. It's sort of equal in prominence. And this is where the quotas really bite. If you just simply can't bring the product in that you need, then that can blow your project economics, not just because it blows your cost, but because it blows your schedule. And so oftentimes the capabilities of overseas manufacturers have also been competitive because they've been able to deliver products on a time scale that our member companies need. And unfortunately, that hasn't been something that the Department of Commerce has required for domestic manufacturers to be able to attest to in terms of their own capabilities. It's just generally, again, a vague claim that they've been able to make. The only improvements that have been made in the process more recently is to add a couple of extra steps to allow for petitioners to offer a rebuttal to an objection to their petition, and then for objectioners to offer a sur-rebuttal to the rebuttal. But it still gives the last word to those who are objecting, and it still doesn't define any more tightly the criteria by which the decision will be made.
Great, thank you. If there's nothing else, there is one hand in the back.
This may be a simple yes or no question, but have there been any observed unintended adverse consequences to the domestic U.S. steel industry as a result of the measures that have been put in place so far?
Yes, I would say yes. One distinction that we see even among our member companies, so our member companies include steel manufacturers. If you are a steel company that is, as I mentioned earlier, integrated in your supply chain across borders, you're not integrated inside the United States if you are kind of a vertically integrated company, or if you are a steel manufacturer that is involved in manufacturing of a steel product, but you're just like one chain in an integrated supply chain or an integrated value chain. There's a distinction. If you're a domestic U.S. steel manufacturer and you've got some integration in your value or your supply chain across borders, then you are negatively impacted if your costs have been increased by the tariffs of the products or the inputs that you import in order to make your products here. If you're a domestic manufacturer and you're just one segment of that, but your value or your supply chain doesn't cross borders, or you're not vertically integrated yourself across borders, then you're probably on net a beneficiary of the policy. So that's one key distinction that we've seen in the characteristics of U.S. steel manufacturers that might put them on one side or the other of the policies.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting that the U.S. steel manufacturers are not objecting to every application, because I think they have, different views as to what exclusions might harm them and what exclusions would not harm them.
Great, thank you.
The gentleman that asked about steel in the 80s, it reminded me of when I was representing a gas company in Pittsburgh in the 80s, and what they told me, they were very upset because they said the federal government did not back them up, and the Japanese were subsidized and decimated the steel business in Pittsburgh. And the reason that it came to me about it was, then FERC said because your purchase efficiencies went down, you purchased less gas because you had less demand because you lost your business enterprise, you are going to be direct billed the purchase deficiencies that the pipelines have to pay the producers under their take-or-pay clauses. FERC eliminated the minimum bill. They said, we won't make you pay a tariff minimum bill anymore. Just buy as much as you need. So they bought what they needed, and then FERC said, well, your purchases are deficient. You must pay the differential to the producers or to the pipeline to reimburse them for the producers. So they felt like here they had one federal government agency destroying their business and another federal agency hitting them with a penalty because of it. So this was a bit of trivia came back to me when I heard that comment.
Can I mean, there's an interesting case study we'll probably be able to look back on when it comes to metallurgical grades of coal. One of the growth areas during the Trump administration has been coal exports from Appalachia, which is very much in line with what the president sought to do. And yet, basic oxygen furnaces use American metallurgical grade coal to make steel that the U.S. has been importing. So if you were to do the math, just because I'm an analyst and that's what I do math, you get about your 13.3 million metric tons equate to about 10 million metric tons of lost export opportunity if 100% of that metallurgical coal were going into basic oxygen furnaces that would be making steel for export to the United States. Now that's the outer boundary, but still, losing 10 million tons of coal exports when they're finally up closing in on 100 million tons a year again would be bad news, especially because the met coal is the good stuff. That pays a lot of job multipliers back home in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Kentucky, Virginia. So one of the ironies.
Another unintended consequence,
Yeah.
too.
And if I could just offer one response to the first part of your question, I think there is a consensus and an agreement between our member companies and most, I think, that there is a need for the U.S. to address market distorting behavior by any other nation state as they engage in global trade. If that certainly includes subsidizing industries that then erode the competitiveness of our firms that are having to compete with that globally. But where I think the administration has moved well beyond that in the steel tariffs, to take an example, is in the scope of the application of those tariffs, to apply them to the whole of the world, to apply them at the levels that have been set, and to continue to have applied them even when we see redoubled efforts by Canada, for example, to address the core problem that began all of it, which was to address the overcapacity and the subsidization of steel manufacturing in China that has oversupplied global markets. The Canadians have really bent over backwards to promulgate even new measures to address transshipment, to address the potential flow of that sort of steel into their market that could make its way into the US, or that could erode the competitiveness of US firms. That has not been rewarded by our administration in terms of carving Canada out of the global application of restricting imports. And so that's where I think there is this distinction between there's a core problem we all agree on that deserved a policy response that we should give credit to the administration for being bold enough to address, but then the wider application not matching that required policy response, nor a de-escalation of the policies that have been promulgated when there's been a response that you would have liked to have seen from your initial move first to try and spark the rest of the world to respond like you want them to.
Thank you very much. I think we are just about out of time.
And we do need a moment for some announcements from Matt Rudolphi, EBA President.
Well, let's give a round of applause to our panel. Fantastic. Just a couple minutes. First of all, I want to thank all of our sponsors, our excellent presenters, and our volunteers for all of the really difficult work that goes on to put on this quality of program, and I really appreciate your efforts. Just so you know, I have been incredibly impressed with our presentations today. If you share my opinion, or even if you don't, this afternoon you were emailed a survey and we're very much interested in your input, what you liked, what you thought might need improvement for next year. On that same note, Norm and his crew are already planning for the annual meeting happening in May, and there will be a call for ideas going out to all of you. And if you have something that you would like us to cover at our annual meeting in May, please get in touch with Norm and his crew, and they will make sure that they see if they can accommodate that. Along with those lines, don't forget to hand in your CLE form. You have probably just about 15 minutes to call your assistant to make sure you remember your bar number, right? And the other thing I wanted to mention was that, for those of you who remember our closing dinner from last year, you might recall that we had some uninvited guests in the form of some protesters. And so in order to make certain that all of our guests are comfortable, including our esteemed guest of honor, Chairman Chatterjee, we are going to ask that everyone clear completely out of this area back to the registration desk so that we can make sure only those who are actually authorized to attend the dinner this evening are the ones that can be invited back in. So I appreciate your cooperation in that. I think you all agree, I hope you'll all agree that we want to make sure that Chairman Chatterjee is comfortable and is made to feel welcome rather than the unfortunate events we had last year. We do have about 30 minutes until we start that program at 5:45. The LGBT Power Group is having an informal happy hour at City Tap House, which is at the corner here of this building. Please feel free to join them if you're so inclined. One more thing. We do have a winner of our Twitter contest, and that is James Cargus, who will be receiving a free wine pull this evening. I've been told also that there are a couple of bonus wine pools that are kind of ahead and above the quality that might have been advertised before in each of the categories. So I hope to see most of you at the dinner this evening. This concludes the substantive part of our meeting. Thank you so much.